All right, raise your hand if you think democracy is a good idea. Keep your hand up if, well, I'm actually looking at how many hands are not up. Right? Keep your hand up if you love democracy. If you love democracy. Keep your hand up if it's one of the most important things in your life. All right, yeah. Well, I think we used to love democracy more. I think 100 years ago, 200 years ago, when democracy was more of an experiment of something new on this planet, we were in love with it. Walt Whitman was in love with democracy. Read some of his poems. He sang its praises. Here's one called, "For You, O Democracy. Come, I will make the continent indissoluble. I will make the most splendid race the sun has ever shone upon. I will make divine magnetic lands with the love of comrades, with the lifelong love of comrades. I will plant companionship thick as trees all along the rivers of America, all along the shores of the Great Lakes, and all over the prairies. I will make inseparable cities with their arms around each other's necks. By the love of comrades, by the manly love of comrades, for you, these from me, O democracy, to serve you, ma femme. For you I am trilling these songs." I think that's a love poem to democracy. I wish we had more of it. And I don't know whether that's one of the reasons why democracy is in danger today. In about 4 weeks, Democracy Spring is going to try to save it. This is a project supported by over 80 organizations, including Code Pink, Democracy Matters, Friends of the Earth, Move On, the National Organization of Women, Peace Action, Public Citizen, Root Strikers, Get Money Out Maryland, Pay to Play, the Unitarian Universalist Association, and our American Ethical Union. Now, just so you know, there's another coalition with similar groups in it called Democracy Awakening, coordinating now with Democracy Spring. They have the same general goal, but they're separate projects. The left has a tendency to do that, splinter off into as many possible groups as you can. But the plan for Democracy Spring is to meet on the morning of April 2nd at the Liberty Bell for a rally kicking off a march to Washington, D.C. A core group's going to walk down Market Street, go across the Schuylkill, go down over to Chester Pike, over to Wilmington, over the Susquehanna to Baltimore, and down to the U.S. Capitol. It's going to take about a week, a little more than a week to do this. There at the Capitol, they're going to engage in a week of media events, public education, and civil disobedience to protest big money in politics. Now, Democracy Spring demands that Congress, quote, "take immediate action to end the corruption of big money in politics and ensure free and fair elections in which every American has equal voice." And to emphasize this demand, over 2,000 people have signed a pledge to risk getting elected, to risk getting arrested as part of a mass sit-in down in Washington to try to draw attention. These people include Harvard professor Loris Lessig and actor Mark Ruffalo, who starred in the Academy Award-winning film Spotlight. Now, although I worry that Democracy Spring is up against a lot, it's up against public apathy, media neglect, and internal friction, I'm going to support it as I can. I cannot walk that route. But I'm going to be at the rally on the morning of the 2nd. I'm going to be helping set up home hospitality for the marchers and other tasks. Just last week, I brought food down to the dozen organizers at their command center down in my home in Tacoma Park. Fancy that, just down the street from me. But here's my question. Given the power of corporations in this country, does Democracy Spring have any chance in minimizing the power of money over politics? Is it doomed to crash like a wave on rocks? Is it going to dissipate, sort of like Occupy did? So what do we know about the power of money in politics? Let's look at some history, my favorite area. See if it has any answers. Now, some traditional narratives about the United States is that we were born out of a victory of democracy over imperialism, right? They say that Mother England wanted cash from the colonies, and that's it. But America replied, no taxation without representation. Now, the luster of American revolutionary ideals is somewhat tarnished by the genocide of the indigenous and the enslavement of Africans. And it's also somewhat tarnished by the fact that it did not turn the world upside down. Except for some loyalists that were chased back to England, the rich white men before the revolution were the rich white men after the revolution. Washington, Madison, Jefferson, right? Some say that democracy really came to the United States in 1800, when the Federalists handed over power to Jefferson. Historian Dan Sisson explains, quote, Jefferson believed his election was a peaceful revolution by the American people, overturning an elitist faction that was stamping out cherished constitutional rights and trying to transform our young democracy into an authoritarian state. It was a transfer of power back to the people, end quote. While it was a significant victory for agricultural money over industrial money, money still ruled and people were still enslaved. Now, 20 years later, Andrew Jackson, representing the common man, attacked the moneyed interests in the form of the National Bank, just downtown. Jackson's populism did lead to the extension of the vote to all white men, propertied or otherwise. More judges were elected, rather than being appointed as a way to shield them against control by the elites. Jackson's biographer praises Jacksonian democracy for, quote, inspiring much of the dynamic and dramatic events of the 19th and 20th century. Populism, progressivism, the new and fair deals, the programs of the New Frontier, the Great Society. All populist programs, right? Paradoxically, though, Jackson accelerated an alternative form of corruption known as patronage, right? The growing middle class in this country supporting Jackson were rewarded with government jobs and positions. So the middle class was getting paid off at this time rather than the elites. So I'm not sure whether that's the best model for getting money out of politics, right? The Civil War brought much more corruption. Government contracts for uniforms, munitions, railroads, and rations made some men very, very rich. After the war, carpetbaggers were lining their pockets with taxpayer money. Ulysses S. Grant, who was personally a very honest person, surrounded himself with money-grabbing partisans. And the very, very wealthy families were close to power, like the Vanderbilts and the Astors. And patronage returned again to the cities under quite often Democratic bosses, like the infamous boss Tweed in New York City, who rewarded friends with inflated government contracts while scattering just enough favors to curry the votes of the poor. Well, the pendulum swung back again towards reform and regulation. New York Times illustrator Thomas Nast created these wonderful caricatures of boss Tweed, and really created, to a good degree, a public demand for an end to that sort of urban corruption. Boss Tweed ended up in jail in 1872, and in 1883 the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act was passed, which curbed patronage and protected government employees from being manipulated by their bosses. Furious at railroad monopolies and how much railroads were charging, the farmers joined the populist wave, and they went from cooperatives to caucuses to the Greenback Party. And the Greenback Party was demanding greenback money, easy money to ease debt, to try to fight money. But even more threatening to the rich was the Populist Party, which nominated James Weaver as their presidential candidate in 1892. And when William Jennings Bryan saw how popular that was, he took populism into the Democratic Party. And the business interests went back to the Republicans as their safeguard. So, at this point comes onto the scene a gentleman named Mark Hanna. Mark Hanna was a kingmaker, a campaign strategist, dime a dozen these days. Mark Hanna was the man who said, there are two things important in politics. The first is money, and the second I can't remember what it is. As chairman of the Republican Party, he put in $100,000 of his own money 100 years ago. That's a lot of money to get William McKinley elected. And he created a science out of campaign contributions. He actually assessed banks and businesses a portion of their capital and funneled that money to the Republican Party. The pendulum swung against this as well after Teddy Roosevelt became president, even though he was involved in dipping into those coffers earlier on. But he got the Tillman Act passed in 1907, and that prohibited banks and businesses from giving money directly to candidates for national office. Any candidate. The 17th Amendment, passed in the progressive way, made senators elected by the people, whereas before they were elected by the state legislatures. They were much more easily controlled by the wealthy there. And in some ways, there was an improvement, but progressivism was primarily a middle-class movement, as I said. In some ways, it offered protections and rights for the very poor, but did relatively little to take money out of politics. Now, in my lifetime, it was the Watergate scandal that really awakened our consciousness to corporations and their influence and money. Just before federal campaign contribution limits kicked in, Nixon supporters were soliciting millions of dollars. The chair of the Texas Republican Finance Committee, in fact, literally filled a suitcase with checks and cash, much of it funneled through a Mexican bank to launder it, and got on a chartered plane and flew to D.C. and got to D.C. 2 hours before the deadline to hand his suitcase over to the committee to re-elect the president. As many of us remember, was nicknamed Creep, an appropriate name. And Creep had an avalanche of cash. That's how they termed it, an avalanche of cash. That money led to the Watergate scandal, all the slush funds around, and the pendulum swung back, and in 1974, President Ford signed the Federal Election Campaign Act. And candidates were now obligated to disclose sources of their contributions. The Federal Elections Commission was created in the 70s, relatively late in our history. But the day after that took effect, forces began literally to line up against these regulations. And soon, in the Supreme Court case of Buckley versus Vallejo, they struck down spending limits as a violation of free speech. And Buckley is what led up to the devastating ruling 4 decades later of Citizens United. Now in the 80s, bolstered by Buckley, the National Conservative Political Action helped defeat 4 longtime Senate Democratic leaders and put Reagan in the White House. So money was still being used very effectively back then. And in the 90s, it's the Democrats that ran into issues. Bill Clinton spoke at 230 fundraising events in the 10 months before the 1996 elections. The Democratic National Committee garnered $122 million in soft money. You know, soft money means money not given specifically to a candidate, and it avoids all these regulations. The Democratic Party used perks like private meetings with the president and flights on Air Force One to garner more contributions. And the vice chair of finance for the DNC was caught laundering over $1 million of money that came from Indonesia, a foreign country, highly illegal. One of the heroes of the Watergate investigation, a guy named Fred Wertheimer, complained that campaign finance laws were, quote, being replaced by the law of the jungle. So despite all these back and forth between reform and regulation, things weren't getting that much better. So in 2002, John McCain and Russell Feingold pushed through the Bipartisan Reform Campaign Act, the Reform Act. And this prohibited unregulated contributions of soft money. But that was nullified again by Citizens United, an act that Wertheimer called a disaster for the American people and the most radical and destructive campaign finance decision in Supreme Court history. And so Citizens United now is the target for most of the efforts of many of the groups. And we're left with the question is, can we fix this system? It's been going on for 200 plus years, and we can't seem to get a handle on it. But it's worse than it's ever been. It's hard to stop money. Are incremental regulations going to be enough? There's one metaphor I think is useful. Andy Kroll, who wrote a book called Follow the Dark Money, said that whenever new reforms take effect, Washington's brightest minds turn to finding out clever ways to circumvent them. Political money moves much like water, always looking for an opening to flow through, and political operatives are only too eager to muddy those waters with anonymous, untraceable cash. One Democratic attorney, Al Reef, actually continued the water analogy. He said, it's like holes in a dike. Once you block one hole, it's going to find its way out another. And that seems to be the fact with campaign cash. Water always finds its way over, under, around, or through whatever's blocking it. And that might be the biggest problem with democracy, and that's something about democracy itself. It's an internal problem. Ostensibly, we give each one of us equal power in our votes. But that's overdone by the power of money. About 60 years ago, Al Black, who was the leader of the New York Ethical Society, described the problem as this. He says, we better fix our internal problems. He said, the crucial question is whether the democratic society can rid itself of its major defects. Excessive inequalities, callous impersonality of relations, the ethics of the marketplace, the abuse of commercializations, the racial and religious and class divisions, the false values of lush materialism. Although democratic society must realistically deal with the threat of military conflicts, it's endangered not so much by external forces as by internal weakness. Right now, money in politics is our biggest weakness. So can a large uprising, a public movement stop this, like Occupy? Now that was at one point a promising movement. It seemed like it came from outside of politics. That's maybe what we need to fix political problems. It came from the streets. And it had a great deal to focus on money in politics. I mean, its ground zero was Zuccotti Park, right in the heart of Wall Street, right? And it seemed like the 99% were poised to take back control of our government from the 1%. But Occupy was crippled because it was a threat to the status quo. It had internal dissension and media apathy and harassment by authorities. Even though it was labeled a peaceful movement by the authorities themselves, the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security was involved in monitoring them. And their Joint Terrorism Task Force infiltrated Occupy cells throughout the country, sowing dissension and mistrust. But more crippling than that, I think, was the general constant criticism and dismissiveness from all of us and from the media. Many criticized Occupy for being unfocused and undisciplined, right? You heard those criticisms. They said they should coordinate their strategy, clarify their message, and sharpen the talking points, right? As if it was a political party and not just a public cry for justice, which is really what I saw the value of Occupy being. Occupy was demanding more from our officials. If politics does what's possible, Occupy wanted to change what was possible. It didn't achieve a lot of its goals, but it did shift the conversation. We're now talking about economic inequality. We're talking about the 1%. Our whole vocabulary has changed. Maybe that's setting the stage to change. But talk is cheap, right? Occupy perhaps was too moderate. I don't know. Maybe the anger it fueled was just transitory. And once we sort of got it out, we didn't need it anymore. Or maybe we're too comfortable and we should have pushed harder. I'm not sure. We certainly didn't get the broad coalitions that we had hoped. I mean, I've heard people criticize Occupy for not reaching out, for example, in issues of race and class. There were lots of divisions. There wasn't a strong public consensus over Occupy. Black Lives Movement now is pointing out that many of the organizers involved didn't take into account the importance of taking a broader agenda. There was mistrust, there was frustration. There were some people wanting to act right now and others saying, wait, what about the process? It's got to be more inclusive. It's got to take on more. I met one local activist this week actually, Michael is here today, who talked about Democracy Spring as being insufficient to bring real change because it doesn't really adequately address issues of systemic and racist and class issues, or it doesn't heal deep enough wounds. The wounds are still too deep in this country. The nature of unfairness, official fraud, corruption, and indifference today is adequate to warrant a national strike. I mean, we should be doing more than marching to Washington, perhaps. Maybe we have to simply all go on strike to demand a change. 400,000 people marched in New York City to change climate change. It had little effect on the Paris conference. Little effect. So what is a walk to Washington, D.C. from Philly going to do? I do not have adequate answers. I just sort of say, got to do something. Got to do something. This Democracy Spring is something. That's why I'm trying to help it out. Part of what appeals to me about Democracy Spring in some ways is that it's not that radical. I'm not a radical. While I envision a radically different future where literally every person is given integrity and rights, I prefer moderate means. I prefer to work inside the system. And maybe it's because I grew up during the Civil Rights Movement, when those leaders worked within the system. Our country moved closer to equal justice under law by ending de jure segregation in public facilities and expanding voting rights. And I learned that nonviolence, which demands that the protesters suffer themselves as witnesses to the injustice in the world, made a difference. Maybe that model is dead. I don't know. Maybe I'm deluded in thinking that the victims of injustice and their allies will willingly continue to suffer for a cause that eludes them in a country that oppresses them. How much can we ask? Maybe I'm wrong in hoping that economic justice can trump economic power. I'm certainly skeptical of my own willingness to suffer deeply for this cause, to risk arrest, to sacrifice the comfort of living as a pastor and a philosopher. I'm soft. We all are soft in some ways. Now, getting arrested on Capitol Hill is probably a heck of a lot easier with this Democracy Spring than it was, for example, getting arrested in Mississippi in the 60s. Occupy is going to have a lawyer who's had decades of experience with civil disobedience cases available to lead a team of pro bono lawyers providing legal counsel. So is this something we should do? I don't know. Will it make the difference? Let me look a little more carefully at what Democracy Spring is actually asking for, what these 80 groups are asking for. As I said, demanding that Congress take actions to end the corruption of big money and to ensure free and fair elections, right? One of the things they do say is as long as the action is nonviolent, they'll support any action or law that leads to these ends. So they're open. But they do have, they say any serious proposal we'll consider. But they have a couple they're suggesting. You can go on their website and see what they are. I'm just going to mention a couple of them. Alabama Representative Sewell's Voting Rights Advancement Act gives the Attorney General of the United States the power to put federal observers at the polls and to monitor states with a pattern of voting rights violations and to look at voting changes and registration changes in states. My own Senator Sarbanes has the Government by the People Act that gives every voter a $25 tax refund just to try to spur small dollar campaign contributions to candidates. And additional funds would be available to candidates who refuse political action committee money. Maybe it's not a lot, it's a little. Senator Durbin has the Fair Elections Now Act that would use voluntary public financing to blunt the influence of the powerful and special interests. Representative Deutsch has the Democracy for All Act, which allows, quote, reasonable limits on raising the spending of money by candidates. And letting state legislatures distinguish between natural persons and corporations. Who could be against these nice-sounding bills? I mean, who could be against the government by the people, voting rights, democracy for all, or fair elections now? We know the answer. The people who are going to be about that are the people who have an inordinate amount to lose. People who are making the most of a system that uses cash to defend cash. And that's why Democracy Spring is asking soon, coming up this week, they're going to begin to ask specific legislatures to take a pledge. It's called the Equal Voice for All Pledge, and it goes like this. I pledge to fight to ensure that our government is free from the corrupting influence of big money in politics and solely dependent upon people as equal citizens by supporting pro-democracy reforms, including voting rights protections, anti-corruption measures, citizen funding elections, and a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. None of that is that radical. None of that is outside the vision of democracy that Walt Whitman offers up to us. It's easy for the politician to say that pledge. It's harder to actually act on it. Unless those politicians take the pledge and mean it, it's not going to change anything. They almost have to see that pledge as sacred. The founder of ethical culture, Felix Adler, actually did see democracy as a sacred venture. He wanted to balance the individual integrity with the needs of the group, and he called that the spiritual end of citizenship. Democracy for him was his civic manifestation of his most important goal. To fulfill democracy's potential, we have to learn to be democratic. We may be social in nature. I think we have these natural abilities that we get from our animal past. But to live together in large groups of people is not easy, and you have to learn that. You have to become citizens. Ben Barber, one of my favorite political theorists, says, "What is required is nothing more than a faith in the democratizing effects that political participation has on men and women. A faith not on what men and women are, but in what democracy makes them." So you have to be open to transforming yourself. George Odell, who embodied the national office of the American Ethical Union for years, said it well. He said, "Democracy is something more than pulling a lever in a polling booth. It means to appeal in social terms, to belong consciously to a community, to share intelligence with others, to do one's work in the world so as to enhance the working power and achievement of others, to recognize that class barriers and economic distinctions are an insult to the human soul, and that in persons there is the possibility of decency." The possibility of decency. Where is that in the campaign? John Lovejoy Elliott, ethical culture leader, believed that only those who have democracy bred into them can be relied on. Through face-to-face discussions with each other, learning and practicing a democratic way of life, working along with people they know, getting engaged. In face-to-face discussions, we get to know each other better. Jane Addams, I talk to all the time, emphasizes conversation as necessary in teaching democracy. She talked about building relationships based on sympathetic knowledge, which transfers your entire life story and emotional context to people in a way that debates and arguments in the press don't. It's person to person. That's the best way to bring out the essence of democracy. But how we transfer that, how we bring decency to the broader platforms of our society is our challenge. It's hard to do that with people who mock us, who oppose us. It's hard to remain decent in the face of economic insecurity or terrorism, fear-mongering. Fear breeds tribalism, and we have so much of that today. Democracy, according to Howard Radist, democratic values, integrity of persons, trustfulness between persons, hopefulness between persons, endure beyond wealth and strength. It is these values that together make democracy not merely a political arrangement, but a mode of living. A mode of living. Let me conclude by saying, I don't know if we're asking too much of our fragile governance, whether we can actually do what has to happen. Can it overcome what is getting in the way of our ideals? Can we protect democracy against corporate power and the politics of hate? Is this springtime for democracy? I don't know. But get involved, and let's see. Thank you very much.